this week, the session is going to be focused on this idea of finding your voice. And, just to sort of recap, we are doing this 3-part sort of, lecture, but also, hoping to address a lot of your questions as well about how to create compelling written science communication. And last time we met, we talked about what science writing is and can be, and went through sort of story models, which are ways of thinking about, the kind of story you want to tell. And with this, we're going to be delving more into the craft of science writing and talk about how to actually tell those stories. So as per usual, if you have questions, please feel free to start throwing them in the chat. I have 2 designated breaks throughout the course of the next hour, where I will try to answer questions that have been written and also take ones if people want to sort of go back and forth. We'll have a few minutes at both of those intervals. So there are a lot of ways to find your voice. If you Google this, whether in the context of fiction writing or nonfiction writing, like there are a million books, a bunch of different, pieces of advice and like ways to go about it. I listed some, here that I think can be really useful in terms of different strategies I've had recommended to me. Free writing where you're just sort of journaling with whatever comes to mind, dialogue exercises where you go out in public and actually listen for the way that people speak and their speech patterns, and sort of play around with those in, sort of writing exercises, playing with word choice and, all kinds of experimentation. But the thing I really wanted to focus on, and the thing that I think is the most important way to find your voice, is identifying your audience. And I know that that probably sounds a little paradoxical, like why am I supposed to be identifying my audience when it's about my voice? But even written communication, right, is communication. It's between 2 or more people. And I think that one of the best ways to figure out how you want to present yourself and how you want to sort of hone the way that you communicate with others is thinking about who you would actually be delivering that message to. So, here I talk about different ways to identify an audience. And what I just want to make clear with all of these is that I think we talk a lot about communicating science to the public, but I think that the public is too broad an idea to really help you narrow down how to be an effective communicator. So I think there are other ways to think through what an audience might be. I think that, one of the big ones is disciplinary. So when you talk to other people in your field, as you would when publishing a journal article, that's a very specific audience, right? You know exactly how to write for them because there is a set of shared knowledge that is implied by, reading and publishing in that journal. There's also, I think, a lot of significance for geography as a way of identifying an audience. I mean, a local newspaper is operating off of the assumption that by living in the same place and therefore having, the same newspaper in circulation, people share similar sort of concerns. And so they're going to want to, hear and see and read that reporting that is geographically linked to the places that they live and work in. I think that, there are a bunch of other sort of possibilities here, identity, sort of political affiliation, shared problems, like when we were talking in the first week about service stories that are aimed at providing people a solution, like that is an audience that shares a problem. They could come from all across the spectrum on every single one of these other points, but the shared problem is the audience, right? So these are different ways to think of them for yourself. And then the other thing I would suggest that can kind of be a bit of a shortcut is just to try to figure out the audience of the publication you want to be writing for. Because if you know that you want to pitch at the end of, this series to National Geographic, well, like, let's figure out who National Geographic's audience is, right? And just kind of like jump over some of these questions by looking at the way that they've written before, the way that they sort of promote themselves in different social media channels and other methods online, and kind of almost reverse engineer like who that audience might be. The other aspect of identifying your audience is that once you've kind of figured out where you're targeting, it's going to require different sort of communication from you, depending on who you have in mind. And so for the purposes of today, what I was thinking is that we could go through 3 case studies about different hypothetical audiences. And so I chose an academic audience in your field. Today, we're going to be using an example from astronomy, so other astronomers. An academic audience in any field, so where we can presume that the readers are, also masters or PhD candidates or holders, and are therefore maybe sort of interested at a higher level in the details of the science, but aren't necessarily like all experts in astronomy. Or a lay adult audience, which will be the final example we'll go through, where you can't really presume that they necessarily are coming to your story with any prior, in this case, astronomical knowledge involved. So we'll go through these, and then we'll have a little bit of a break to kind of talk through some of the examples I presented. As we go through them, I made a list of some of the things that I think are important to consider, and I'll call a few of these out as I saw them in the examples that we go through. But when we're looking at these pieces, let's think about the assumed prior knowledge of the audience and how that comes through in the way it's written. The scaffolding of new information. So I think that this is such a key question. Like, what do we need the readers to know at each stage that we can keep pulling them through the piece of writing? Let's also look at word choice, sentence structure, and then finally, like, what sort of persuasive techniques are being used in order to bring together not just the sort of basic logical facts of the science, but also some of the like ethos and pathos of the work that goes into science. So for the first one, okay, case study academics in your field. So I have selected here the coverage of the James Webb Telescope launch, which I think is a great set of examples for how this one event is translated almost through 3 different perspectives. So first, I wanted to have everyone look at this piece from Optics and Photonics News. I'm adding it to the chat, but you should just be able to sort of follow me here. So this piece, Optics and Photonics News, is people who make things like telescopes, right? This is a trade publication, trade being sort of the kind of jargony journalistic word for a publication for a specific field. So it's being written for people who are in optics research and also in optics on the business side. And so they're going to be, watching this James Webb Telescope launch with great interest. So the telescope goes up on December 25th. And already from the very beginning, I see markers that this is for a scientific audience with a high level of presumed knowledge. For example, 1250 UTC, like I think that we can all infer that that is a time zone, but I don't think that a lot of us necessarily are comfortable using UTC in our everyday life. So that's like one indicator right off the top. From there, we get into this discussion of the telescope and its launch vehicle, and that its destination is something called the L2 Lagrange point. Now, there's no explanation of what the L2 Lagrange point is, except that it's the destination and that it's over 1 million miles away from Earth. The presumption here is that if you're reading this article from Optics and Photonics News, you already know L2, you're super familiar with it, it's not going to trip you up. And almost as if it would be kind of repetitive or maybe underestimate you as a reader if we were to explain it here, because of course, astronomers are already so familiar. As it sort of progresses, I think that you see this sort of repetition of assumptions about what people know. And one of the biggest assumptions I would say is that this is presumed to be important to the audience already. There's really no effort to say like what the Webb telescope is going to discover or why it is going to be so important at the very top of the story. Instead, it's just saying, obviously, you've been watching this, and so you're relieved that there is a flawless launch. So as I looked through the story, those were some of the things that were very obvious to me as a astronomy person reading it. The assumed knowledge is high, as we can tell from the jargon, and the assumed interest is also high, as we can tell from the beginning of the story, which does fairly little to persuade readers of the value of the telescope. So, that was just sort of like a blog post to kind of let people know that this had happened. But I think that that's one way of thinking about how you would target information for your audience. Now, this all becomes much more interesting as you look in contrast with other outlets. So here I've selected the coverage in Science in their news and commentary section about the exact same event. So when we look at the Science example, which I'll also put in the chat for anyone who wants to read a little deeper, from the beginning, we have this sort of pathos, right? That this is about a gift to astronomers. Astronomers are excited. So even if you are, like in a bench lab doing very, basic biological research, or, you are an environmental scientist, who this is important to. And I think the sort of message is that it might be important to you simply because it is important to your colleagues and to the sort of field of science more generally. As we go through, what you see is that Science is, like, look already here, 7:20 a.m. EST. So they've dropped UTC. They're like, that's too confusing. We're going to get to a more relatable, way of telling time. But crucially, Science is a publication that is really focused on the practice of science globally. And so I think what they're trying to do with this introduction, where they talk about the cost of the telescope, is to kind of pull in readers who are interested in the connection between science and policy and science and funding mechanisms. So if that's why you're reading Science, right, they're giving you that angle right up top and saying that this astronomy story is going to fit into that larger interest that they believe you share as a reader and a member of the sort of science reading community. Similarly, it is already starting to try to tell us a little bit of that like ethos pathos component of like, this is going to revolutionize astronomy. So stick with us, even if this necessarily isn't your area of expertise or your natural, set of interests. As we go through this story, they do a lot of work compared to optics and photonics news to build in the timeline of the telescope's development, as well as to outline its long-term goals. So they want us to know sort of what has gone into its funding, its engineering, and why this was all required, right? So that it can take on these tasks after its deployment. As I read this, I sort of felt that the assumed knowledge was medium. And the reason that I say that is that there is jargon, right? We have words like solar array, L2 makes another appearance, but the jargon is often sort of explained, at least, minimally, so that there could be sort of inferences made. So to break down like one sentence excessively, like let's look at this. It says that there's a solar array and that it's needed to charge batteries and support communication with Earth from the James Webb Telescope. So when I look at this, I think, okay, so they want us to know that they don't have to sort of simplify a term like solar array. They think that we can figure it out, but they want to give us some context about why the solar array matters. So when I read this sentence all together, what my takeaway is that, this solar array, I'm going to infer, is an energy generating mechanism that is on the telescope to power these batteries and support the communication with Earth. That is not spelled out for me. If I, didn't have the sort of scaffolding that they provide here, plus some, other sort of information that I'm drawing on from my familiarity with solar arrays, I might not be able to sort of glean much from this sentence. But they're expecting that their scientific audience absolutely is. Similarly, I think that their use of L2, which is just dropped into the Optics and Photonics News article with no additional information, is actually, expanded on here, but not that much, where now they're telling us that L2 is a gravitational balance point. Now, I personally did not know what a gravitational balance point was, but I think that, the assumption is that a lot of science readers would. And so you're maybe not familiar with L2 as a standalone concept, but as they string these things together, the jargon starts to make sense. Similarly, I think that the assumed interest is also medium. As I mentioned, I think that they really take great care highlighting some of the details that their audience in particular might care about, like the timeline and funding of the telescope. And then I think they also do a good job of kind of scaffolding for us some of that inverted news pyramid structure, right? Of like, this event happened, this is what went into this event happening, and this is where this event will lead. So having read this, I have a pretty good sense now of why the James Webb Telescope exists. All of this is then contrasted further by the lay adult audience example, where I've chosen the New York Times. And I will once again send this over via the chat if people want to look into it a little more. But I think that you can see just right from the beginning how the Times has taken such a different approach, because they are writing for an audience, as we discussed last time, that has like a middle to high school reading level and is presumed not to have any sort of scientific expertise at all. So from the beginning, we see that the James Webb Space Telescope has launched on its journey to see the dawn of starlight. That's such a more evocative, specific, and also sort of like emotionally kind of impactful idea right from the very top, right from the headline. I think that they follow through on that by starting to talk about how astronomers are jubilant, how it's going to offer a keyhole into the earliest moments of the universe. They're constantly toggling between the, the sort of emotion of the launch and selling you almost on the consequence of the telescope. They're saying like, please care, please click, please read about this. Even if you don't necessarily have an interest in astronomy, this is a story for you. That continues throughout, the rest of the article, which is following roughly an inverted pyramid style. Its emphasis is so deeply on the humans involved in the process that you get very little about the telescope itself until several paragraphs in. They start to explain what its mission is, a little bit about its funding and development. But I really think that a line like this is so indicative of what the Times believes its readership, subscriber base really cares about, which is this line about astronomers watching the launch remotely from all over the world, many zooming together in their pajamas were jubilant, right? Like they want to sell you on the sort of human experience, because that might be more relatable than the telescope itself. So as you go through that, you just start to really see how they're tailoring information for audiences in such different ways. The Times, as I said, I think that their assumed knowledge on the part of the reader is low. Among other things, that article even explains why the telescope is named James Webb, which, I don't think any other of the audiences that we just sort of perused through would either care about, or in the case of, astronomy buffs, they would already know. They also sort of try to relate it to some knowledge that they assume that you might have, and almost kind of try to walk you out of like the quicksand of a comparison. So the Times, for example, says, very explicitly, if you've heard of Hubble, this is very different for X, Y, and Z reasons. So they're kind of trying to play around a little bit with what they think you might know and making sure that you understand how this differentiates itself from other things you've heard in passing. Similarly, I think that their assumed interest is low, not zero. I don't think that they are actually trying to, force the James Webb Telescope, in front of any readers. It's probably not the most important story of the Times that day, but I think that they do assume that you're coming to this because it just sort of caught your eye. But that they have to persuade you that it's eye-catching, which we see from the way that the very headline is designed to attract people and emphasize the sort of emotion here. Because I think emotion is something that is seen as often more relatable, at least in sort of that initial kind of pulling the reader in moment, than a lot of just hard facts. So I think that, all of these are complicated kind of considerations, and we'll continue to break some of it down. But to me, like, I love this quote. I think that it's such a perfect encapsulation of the struggle that all of these three pieces faced, which is, how do you not overestimate your reader's knowledge without underestimating their intelligence? And the more you understand your audience, the better you're going to be able to strike that balance. So with that sort of all in place, Are there any questions at this stage? I will stop sharing my PowerPoint for a moment. I would love, yeah, to talk about other observations people had or questions they had about that set of examples. Okay, cool. No worries. I will keep going. Yeah, I think that as you sort of sit with some of those links, the examples start to become more clear. And I think also too, in your own areas of expertise, as you toggle through studies that excite you, I think that you should go and look for the way that they're written up in more mainstream publications, because I think that it can kind of reveal some of these contrasts in the way that audience shapes the message. Monica has a question about how emotional is too emotional. Like, when does it become clickbait? That's a great question. I think that my feeling is that the emotions should be dictated by the actual sources. So I think in that case, astronomers actually were jubilant. I don't think that that was an overstatement. They had spent, I think, 7 years developing the telescope, and the most pivotal moment was this launch, and then the 30 days after, to make this billions of dollars enterprise successful. So I really do think that that moment was one full of enthusiasm for them. I think the point at which you cross over into clickbait is when you start to overstate negative or positive the emotions that people are having. And so it's important, just I think, to have reported out, however you do that what you're saying is accurate. Yes, and totally agree. So Aura makes the point that the New York Times headline is very poetic, and that the dawn of starlight isn't something you'd see in a scholarly publication. I think that's so true. I thought that the Times presentation was really beautiful on that story, and also the way that they fold in photographs of the launch, photographs of the telescope's development that they already had from previous articles. They sort of make it a little interactive. There's more to click out if you want to know more. I think all of that is really important in terms of something we'll talk about today, which is, I think that you're trying to make an experience for people when you are doing science communication. You're not just trying to get a fact in their head. You're trying to give them a sort of, world, however big or small, that they can kind of walk through themselves and realize, the information that they want to take away. And so, that sort of back and forth between your voice and your audience, I think the Times really nailed what their readership would be interested in at that moment. And the other thing I had to say about the Times article is that they're also thinking of it serially. Like, they're trying to give you an update in that article that this launch was successful, but they've continued to do James Webb Telescope pieces, and will for the rest of its deployment. So if people who want to follow along, they'll continue to have new content all the time and continue to dive deeper into some of these ideas. One thing that I think I forgot to mention is that the L2 Lagrange point, which is such a big presumed feature of the optics and photonics news coverage, is not even mentioned in the Times piece. They've done away entirely with the L2 concept, because I think they deemed it sort of extraneous to the story they wanted to tell at that time. If people were to come back and at the time that the telescope reaches its destination in space, I think they'll have a whole big explainer about what L2 is, why this was chosen, all of those sort of details. But when they were talking about the launch, they were like, this doesn't matter right now. So also the way that information is sort of egg-sized in order to make a point, I think is a difficult thing to sit with, but a very important part of communicating for lay audiences in particular. Awesome. Okay, well, if there are any other questions, definitely let me know, but I will get this going again. Okay. Great. Can everybody see the presentation? We're good to go? All right. I'm a little worrywart now. Okay. So I wanted to break the second half of this presentation into this conversation of craft And I think that it has two stages. So the work that has to go into crafting a piece before you start to write, and then the work that comes after you have that sort of first draft and you're more in the sort of refinement and editing stages. So before writing, I think that it's really important to have an outline. I think that it's interesting. There's a lot of different ways to think about outlines. I think like most immediately, it's about making sure that you have all of the information you need in front of you to start to translate it into, you know, an actual sort of written work of science communication. I think, you know, we all use outlines obviously every day, but the purpose of an outline for writing a story is really thinking through the scaffolding of information. And I know I keep using this term, but I think that that is just so key to communicating to an audience, is to make sure that like each step is plotted so that they're not going to get to a point where they're like, wait, how did this come to be, right? Like, where is this information coming from? Where is this story coming from? That you've guided them through it bit by bit. So, you know, here in the far corner, we have our handy dandy inverted pyramid, which, as we've discussed, is the sort of basis of all news writing. And that is about scaffolding information with the priority to what's new. So you put what's new at the top, and then everything else is below that in terms of importance, and therefore in terms of rank of the story. Context is available, but you have to go and pursue it because the goal is just to communicate what's new. Elsewhere here, though, I have included, you see this chronological one right here, right? Chronology, I think, is really underrated in storytelling. If you are struggling with something that feels really complicated and over the top, make an outline that is just based on what happened when. I don't know if anyone likes reading like investigative medical books, but if you go and look at like Bad Blood about Theranos, or if you look at Empire of Pain about the Sacklers, those books are what's called TikToks before TikTok, where the action is just the TikTok of what happens chronologically. And like, yes, sometimes the writers will do a little bit of like authorial sort of artistry and try to give you like a scene or, you know, some sort of way of pulling you out and putting you back into the narrative. The whole crux of those big, powerful, successful books is just a chronology. It's just the TikTok of how these things unfolded. Here we have two really unique, over the top, probably not necessarily the most useful at this stage, examples of outlines. Both of them are from John McPhee, who is a fantastic nature writer. This one, ABC over D, was a structure that he developed for a book he wrote called Encounters with the Archdruid in the 1970s. And his idea was that he wanted to illuminate the role of one environmentalist by putting them quite literally into contexts where they were sort of profiled through juxtaposition. So he sent them river rafting, and then he sent them hiking, and he sends them with all of these different people who sort of reveal over time, you know, who this person is, what their goals are, and sort of the state of environmentalism of that era. Here he has, from travels in Georgia, this outline he developed up the Fibonacci spiral. And his idea was that the turtle would be sort of the turning piece on which the story unwinds. But then, similar to our inverted pyramid, at a certain point, the story has surpassed itself and is moving into the future. And there's sort of this long tail where things become less clear and there's more unknown. On the far sides, I have, you know, the hero's journey and then the sort of rising climax, which are both still really common in fiction and mythology. And I think that, you know, science communicators can learn so much and pull so much from our recreational fiction reading. Fiction writers know how to tell a story, and there's nothing wrong with sort of cribbing those methods when the nonfiction really fits. And so I think that, you know, what I wanted to do in talking through some of these was not to say like something prescriptive about use this in these cases, but was to say that scaffolding of information is important, and that I think often it requires a sort of visual step where you are not only sort of creating a bullet point of everything you want to put into your piece, but you're actually starting to draw them out. I think that like it's almost like an information landscape that you're moving through. And I think like looking at these examples of what, active science communicators are doing and how creative and almost outlandish some of them can get in the case of John McPhee, that it's a great reminder that it's good to just sit down once you have sort of decided on your story and start to draw out how you will show it to other people through, the words and reporting that you're going to do. So once we have our information sort of outlined, that I think is the only prerequisite to writing. I think that everything about good writing happens in the edit. I have never written a great first draft. I've written good third, fourth, and fifth drafts. And I think that especially for people who have, really expert knowledge and advanced, education and research in science, it can be really stressful to hear words like jargon because it's like some third rail that you can't touch. But the truth of the matter is that it's almost impossible to avoid jargon once you've sort of, and kind of enveloped it into your vocabulary and way of thinking. And so it's not about avoiding jargon in your first draft. It's just about removing it when it's not helpful in your second, third, and fourth draft. So as we go through, all of this I see as being something that you can work through after you've gotten the basic story outlined and on the page. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was at the smallest unit of the word. So, in talking about jargon, I think that, there's a lot of anxiety about how do we not get people who have never heard these words before tripped up. And I think that there are a lot of ways people think through this. One is the idea of avoiding what we call like $10 words, which is just a joke that they cost too much money to buy. They're too complicated, too many syllables. Maybe you can, break them down in more accessible ways, swap them out with more common phrases. So that's something that as you're sitting with, your first draft, you can literally go through and be like highlighting words where you're like, where did this come from? This, is a $10, $20 word. Similarly, I think that you can control find for banned words, like Carl Zimmer has a list highlighted here, and I'll share these slides with you all of, words that he thinks are jargon. And if you know that there's like jargon in your field that you hear a lot, just like control find in your second draft and be like, where is this serving the reader and where is this getting people tripped up? One of the suggestions that I think even for people who don't struggle with jargon is so important is that I think when we are talking about word choice, like there's this inclination to run to a thesaurus and start just like swapping the words out, just being like, how do I get any sort of variation in here? But John McPhee, once again, has said so wisely that I think that the best thing you can run to is a dictionary, because a dictionary will tell you what a word is, not simply an alternative. And what that word is actually the kind of key, I think, to breaking open how you actually want to communicate that, what words you actually want to choose. Because do you need actually one specific word, or maybe can you give a little bit more life and a little bit more room to your story and fill it in with some, of your own voice? Do you want to just swap something out, or do you want to actually improve the sentence, right? And start to add action and character and, different sort of stylistic choices in there. So that I just think is so important, that the thesaurus has its place, but it's actually something that I think we can over rely on a little bit. And then this has already been a theme in the way that we were talking about how the New York Times cut the L2 point from their coverage of the James Webb Telescope and some of the other decisions that they made, which is that ultimately, I think a lot of science communication is about compromise in terms of what you want to tell and what you actually think your audience is going to be able to receive. And I think that, a funny example of that is that like a lot of people can cite like 100 digits of pi, but most people only need 3.14. And how much are they really losing in a generic, mention of pi from having all those extra digits cut? Not a lot. It may be painful to do. Maybe the mathematician feels, the sort of cleavage of these extra digits as something difficult. But ultimately, if they're writing for a lay audience, the rewards are going to be there because they are going to be able to better communicate. People aren't going to be getting tripped up. and they'll sort of actually understand what's being communicated. So at that most fundamental level, we really do have these kind of considerations of word choice. From there, I think it's important to really start to think about sentences, which I think of as being the sort of units of information. So, words are very craft-based, stylistic, they can evoke, but the sentence is where we were actually starting to, gift to your readers real insight. And so when thinking about sentences, one of the biggest and easiest things to do to improve the sentence structure of your stories is to just make sure that your sentences are variable. I've seen a lot in recent years, this sort of emphasis on the idea that if you only write with the 1,000 most common words in the English language, anyone would be able to understand you. I don't know if people have seen this, but it was sort of a big topic in SciComm for a while. And I just am so averse to that. I think that that is just simply not true. I think you can actually make yourself more confusing to people if you're, artificially limiting your word choice. And if you're creating sentences that are all the same, you will not have a reader for very long. It's so important that your writing is kind of speech-like, that it's variable, that there are short sentences offset by longer sentences, that every sentence is serving its purpose. So if I'm saying, something looked a certain way, right? Maybe that's a fairly short sentence. But then if I go on to explain how that, appearance actually, sort of hides or represents all of these larger ideas, maybe that is a longer sentence. And bringing those together is going to create the most interesting experience for a reader who will actually want to stick around. Whereas I think, only using the 1,000 most common words in English will eventually get pretty tedious for everyone involved. Similarly, I think that this is probably one of the biggest transitions from doing scientific writing to writing about science. And that is writing as if there are no citations and no follow-ups, right? Like the biggest hope you can have is that you create a complete enough story that people are not having to click out or Google or follow up to understand what you're saying. And I think that the journalistic equivalent of this is adding like 1 million hyperlinks and just like assuming, well, people will open them if they want to know. And it's like, no, you really need to do your best to include all of the information that somebody would really need to understand you in the primary text. And I think that again, just comes back to this idea of letting yourself have the space that you need to communicate. It's not about being super efficient because, every sentence is just telling the basics and citations will take you elsewhere. It's about creating an experience for a reader. And sometimes that just requires more space. The final thing that I had wanted to say about sentences was this idea of the ladder of abstraction. I'm sure that this brings back terrible memories of like high school or freshman composition. But the ladder of abstraction really does have immense value. I think that what it means is that over the course of, these variable sentences, not only do they need to vary in terms of sort of length, but also in terms of content, because it is useful to people to go from very concrete, physical descriptions all the way to like these big ideas and back down again. And thinking about it from this ladder, I think really helps you to kind of calibrate, the way that you are communicating information. Like, have you overemphasized a lot of the physical? Are there more sort of ideas or emotions that you can inject in there, at the higher level of abstraction? Have you written a story that is like literally just about emotion and you forgot to mention the details of the telescope? Like, then you can bring us back down the ladder of abstraction. So sentences, I think, are really about, like thinking through what am I actually communicating and how am I doing that effectively through these stylistic choices. The big idea that I think that a lot of these things add up to is this, mantra of showing, not telling, which is another one that at least makes me feel like I am in an undergraduate college class and I'm very panicked about whether or not I'm telling too much or showing enough. But I think that it is like a useful idea. Sorry about the sirens in the back. But I think that showing, not telling is an extremely useful idea and something to return to as you're revising your own work. The basic premise is that people are going to respond to a story in which they are brought along, almost like on a scavenger hunt, right? Like what I keep saying about this experience, where they're brought along on sort of the discovery of information, that they're almost like, you know, like co-conspirators in this sort of learning that's happening, as opposed to like this very didactic experience, which maybe you all feel like you were being subjected to right now, or one person is just monologuing. It's like, how do you bring people through with you as you're writing? And some of the tactics that I think are useful through this show don't tell idea are that you can construct a scene before you convey information. And so a scene would be like, if we were talking about this class, maybe you'd talk a little bit about like what I'm like as a presenter, and what you can sort of see in the Zoom background behind me. And then you would start to talk about some of the things I'm sharing, through my PowerPoint and some of that information. And in setting that scene, describing that sort of like tonal quality, you bring people with you. You're inherently showing, even if the sort of work that you go on to do is to tell them, of a new scientific discovery, you've sort of counterbalanced the two. Another thing that happens at the sentence level is being really careful about using active voice. And active voice, I think, really just comes down to the idea that everything has an entity responsible for it, right? Like all science started with someone doing something. So make sure that that someone doing something is there in the story and is, named and described as such. And that it's not just like discoveries are coming out of nowhere, or, the lab beaker broke. It's like someone knocked it, or, something caused it to fall, right? Like, how do we build that sort of active narrative into everything that we write? So X did Y versus Y happened. And then, just coming back to this idea of all of this requiring you to slow down. Inherently, I would be able to tell you, everything in 3 bullet points that I think you should know. But in trying to show you a little bit about it, I'm talking for an hour. And a story is going to be somewhat similar, where the goal is to give yourself the space to actually, help a reader learn something new, as opposed to just sending them a few bullet points and hoping that they get the picture and move on, themselves. The probably single biggest recommendation that I would like to make for science writing when it comes to these craft questions is the power of analogy for science. Obviously, analogies can go very wrong. I think we have all come across examples where we're like, no, like that does not fit. But a great analogy is unbeatable. And I think of it as being a bridge between the known and the unknown. So if you can create an analogy about something that you do expect your audience to understand in order to help them understand the new information you're bringing them, like that is just like bona fide great science communication. It's obviously very hard. I think that you have to sort of beta test it on friends and family. But analogy is a great way of potentially going up and down the ladder of abstraction in one fell swoop, of kind of creating these like anchor points for a reader as they go through, so that they can assimilate new knowledge, even if they didn't understand everything from the beginning. It's so helpful. And there are a lot of great examples, I think, in physics writing in particular, of efforts that have been made to create these sort of foundational analogies that are still in place in physics, right? That for 50 years have been holding up as the analogy that helps people understand some abstract concept. So those are all little different pieces that go into these kinds of considerations. And I wanted to bring it back around ultimately to the idea that I called this finding your voice, and then have talked for 50 minutes about finding your audience. And I think that it's because I kind of feel that they are the same thing. And what I mean by write for yourself is not to write for the person you are right now, but to write for the person you were before you entered your PhD program, or before you, had acquired all of this sort of knowledge or started working in this lab. Like the person who was super curious and didn't have all of the information left, but was eager to learn and ready to hear from you about your experiences and your insight. And I think that that kind of place, coming from writing for your younger self, however much younger we're talking about, days, months, years, really is a great way of sort of anchoring the kind of audience that you have in your mind, especially if you don't yet know what publication you're writing for or any of the sort of, demographics of your readership. So that sort of brings these ideas full circle. Are there other questions at this point? Would love to hear. Okay, so Austin says, is it acceptable to discuss another researcher's work without citing them when writing for a lay audience? Also, would it be appropriate to communicate another scientist published research without first consulting them? Okay, I think these are great questions. I think that attribution is considered to be really important when the work is the focal point of the story. And in the case of news writing is the news, right? So I would never want to write a story where your research is being referenced, in the headline, in the lead, like it's what's the story is about. And I never mention you, like that would feel really bad. But if in the process of writing that story about your work, I reference some of the work that came prior that your work was built upon, I wouldn't necessarily feel that each of those items had to be individually cited. That might be a case where I would hyperlink out if people wanted to read more, but I wouldn't consider that necessarily essential information in understanding the news I'm bringing to them, which is your research. So that's how I'd answer that first question. When it comes to communicating another scientist published research without first consulting them, I think that is a more difficult question. I think that if it is something that a single person or lab has really pioneered, like they are the go-to people, no one has really added much to their sort of corner of the research literature, then it's super important to reach out to them and talk to them about sort of your aims in science communication, and also to ask for clarification on questions you might have that might not have been answered in the literature they've put out so far, and just to sort of be in touch with them. I think that it is a little bit different when you're talking about something that is almost a matter of consensus. For example, I think that at this point, climate change has been so aggressively and widely contributed to that when we talk about the current consensus of climate change, it would be almost impossible to cite all of the researchers involved. And at that point, it's okay to just start talking about the science as is. I think that it ends up being more of, do you feel like you've done your due diligence? Are there any sort of traps you might be walking into because you didn't talk to people about the state of their work? And do you feel like that is somebody who you might end up inadvertently offending, by sort of seeming as if you're claiming the work for your own? So those would be the things I try to balance there. Okay, so Yash has a question sort of comment. So if you write a view that is opposing to something someone wrote, sort of changing the narrative on them of this idea of cancellation. Yash, would you be willing to say a little bit more about sort of what you're thinking there so that I can make sure I'm actually talking to the comment adequately?
Okay. For example, talking about if someone talks about the disadvantages of microwaving food, like my mom would send me an article like that every other day.
Right.
There's research that goes both ways because the research has different criteria, different target demographics, the conditions are different, and you can get results whatever way you want based on the experiments. So I was just wondering, can I write an article saying this person who wrote this doesn't know anything?
Okay, no, that is a great question. So my feeling is that you would have a great article there because you would be able to walk people through the reason why the literature could come out both ways. Like that feels like really important and illuminating for people who are worried about microwaving food, to say like the reason you're seeing so many studies that seem convincing is because if you set them up this way, they will come out with these, sort of results. So I think that that's a case of showing, not telling. So you would probably get a lot of pushback if you said these people don't know anything. If you showed how they don't know anything, you would have a great science journalism article. So that's kind of my sense there. Of course, like all of these things absolutely can be contentious. I think that I get yelled at frequently, and you just kind of have to roll with it and make sure that what you're citing is something that you feel is reliable, and as true as is possible given everything we know and don't know at the time. Okay, Caitlin says, I work on an RNA protein complex that was recently discovered in 1984, and very few people in the world study it. When I write, I have to spell everything out. How do you strike the balance between defining your technical language and not boring your audience? That's a great question. I think that I really liked Aura's point about the New York Times headline and the idea that like Dawn of Starlight is something that wouldn't necessarily appear in a hard science, peer-reviewed sort of publication. But I think that language is super powerful in striking the balance between being as definitive and comprehensive as possible with still being interesting. So I wonder if, Caitlin, there would be ways that you could talk about the RNA protein complex using, analogy, rich language, and other sort of descriptors, where you just refine at a sentence level every, piece of information you're sharing so that it's just a pleasure to read. I think that is, sort of where less of a fiction sort of novel kind of framework works, and where we start to think about like the influence of poetry on the way that we write, and that there's so much value to be gleaned in just reading people who are having a good time with words and experimenting with them, and that you might find that you can try that for yourself and write the world's most beautiful but also accurate RNA protein complex primer. Are there other questions? We still have a few minutes.
Eleanor, I'd like to explore something you just said, given this group of students that we have here, and this is that you get yelled at frequently, because I think being a graduate student means that you're very regularly getting pretty harsh feedback. So can you talk a little bit how you work through that and how you evaluate whether these things are valid or whether they're sort of disagreement, and how you're going to respond to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's very difficult, and while I've gotten more tactics for it, it never gets less like emotional. Like when it happens, I'm always like, I tend to feel like it's time to spiral out about it, and have mostly just got better at kind of going through my checklist of like what's actually a practical response. And like to that end, I think the things that have been helpful for me are giving it a break, like stepping away from it for a few minutes, like making a cup of tea, because when your like heart rate starts to get up because you've like gotten an email that tells you that you're all wrong and the stupidest person who ever lived, it's like, okay, like let's take a step back, and then come back to it and try to break down like what the central complaints are, or sort of points of complaint if there are multiple, and start to actually triangulate that with the piece that you've written or whatever it is that they're commenting on. So if someone said, like this is totally false, I would go and see like, is this totally false? And, be open to the possibility that maybe they knew something that I didn't, and that, the end result would be issuing a correction. Most of the time when people tell you something is totally false, it is not, and everything is okay. And you had, completely valid citations for all of those statements that you made. But I think like kind of that humility can be really helpful once you've stepped away and tried to kind of manage your, anxiety response. And then I think, as you move through that of seeing like, okay, maybe nothing I did was factually inaccurate, right? Maybe I have great citations for everything I said, but maybe I missed a point that would have added a whole other layer of context. And that person is maybe not being nice about it, but has a great point about how in the future I could write about this topic more, kind of conclusively, more holistically. And so I keep a spreadsheet of feedback like that I get, with my sort of like takeaway, like reminder of like, next time you come back to this topic, or, next time you're working on anything contentious, like here's, the sort of information that I gleaned from that. And so, yeah, I think it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure. The sort of third step I would say is communicating to your editor, or, a mentor, or whoever you might trust who's been collaborating with you on what it is you wrote, or produced, and just say like, hey, I got this feedback. This is my takeaway at this point because I spent the time down regulating my nervous system and thinking through it systematically, but I just wanted to run it by you. And most of the time they're going to write back and be like, that totally makes sense. Like you had, the right sort of response here. But if, action needs to be taken, like a correction needs to be issued or a letter needs to be written to someone to say like, I think you have a great point. I'm sorry that I didn't include it. Then your editor or your mentor or whomever, can help you through that process so that it's not just you out there alone, taking on online critics or, whomever may have come to you with these complaints. So that's sort of where I've arrived at after 6 years of being yelled at on the internet.
That's such a great answer. And I think the other side of it that was going through my mind is what happens the next time you're writing something contentious and about a contentious topic and you can't, how do you keep yourself from becoming less challenging of things you want to be challenging of?
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, like, I feel that so much. There was a point at which for like 6 months, like I just had this really bad experience and no correction even resulted. Everything was fine. But the sort of, I just was not prepared for the emotions of being challenged consistently by someone who was wrong. And I just started adding less detail to my stories. My stories became sort of more superficial because I was like, well, if you go too much into the sort of weeds here, then people will just be able to pick apart everything you've said. And after a certain point, I was like, no, like, I'm not going to, give up on my sort of central duty and interest here, and got back to it. But that's when I started implementing the spreadsheet where I'm like, how do you make larger takeaways out of these things instead of just letting yourself stew in the specifics of whatever someone brought to you as a complaint?
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I know that's sort of personal, but also a topic so relevant to this group of students. So
absolutely. And to that end, I would just extend to all of you that if this ever happens to you or if you're anticipating it, like, please reach out. I'm happy to read things in advance to guard against it or help you navigate, a situation that has sort of erupted. I really empathize with all of that. So
you can at least commiserate at the
yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with us again today, Eleanor.